The warm afternoon sun cast long shadows across Maple Street as Dr. Eleanor Washington drove her silver Mercedes home from another busy day at the university. After 40 years as a civil rights attorney and now serving as a distinguished law professor, she had grown accustomed to the peaceful drive through the suburban neighborhoods of Cedar Grove. The 68-year-old woman hummed softly to the classical music playing in her car, her silver hair neatly styled and her navy blue suit still crisp despite the long day of lectures and meetings. As she approached the intersection of Maple and Oak Street, she came to a complete stop, just as she had done thousands of times before at this familiar corner. In her rear-view mirror, she noticed a police cruiser that had been following her for the past few blocks. Dr. Washington didn't think much of it. She had always been a careful driver and had never received so much as a parking ticket in her life. However, just as she turned onto Oak Street, the cruiser's lights began flashing, and the sharp sound of its siren cut through her peaceful afternoon. Officer James Barrett had been having a rough day. At 32, he was known among his colleagues for his quick temper and what some called his old-school approach to policing. He watched as the Mercedes pulled over to the side of the road, its tires crunching softly on the fallen autumn leaves. The dark clouds that had been threatening rain all afternoon finally opened up, and a light drizzle began to fall as Officer Barrett stepped out of his cruiser. He adjusted his cap and squared his shoulders, walking with deliberate slowness toward the Mercedes. His hand rested casually on his belt, near his holster, a habit he had developed over his 8 years on the force. "License and registration," he barked before even reaching her window, his voice carrying a tone that suggested he had already made up his mind about the driver. Dr. Washington calmly reached for her purse and the glove compartment. "May I ask what seems to be the problem, officer?" she asked politely, her voice carrying the gentle authority of someone who had spent decades in courtrooms and lecture halls. Officer Barrett's face twisted into a smirk as he finally looked through the window. The sight of an elderly black woman in an expensive car seemed to amuse him. "You ran that stop sign back there," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "This is a pretty nice car you're driving. Is it yours?" The rain started falling harder now, but Officer Barrett made no attempt to speed up the process. Dr. Washington felt her heart rate increase slightly, not from fear, but from a familiar disappointment. In all her years fighting for civil rights, moments like these reminded her why her work remained so important. "Yes, Officer Barrett," she replied, reading his nameplate, "this is my car, and I can assure you that I made a complete stop at that intersection. I drive this route every day." The officer's smirk grew wider. "Step out of the vehicle, ma'am," he ordered, emphasizing the ma'am in a way that made it sound more like an insult than a courtesy. Dr. Washington noticed a young couple across the street had stopped to watch the scene unfold. The woman had her phone out, recording the interaction. Another car slowed as it passed, the driver clearly concerned about what they were witnessing. As she carefully stepped out into the rain, her designer shoes splashing in a puddle, Dr. Washington maintained her composure. The water began to dampen her suit, but she stood straight and dignified, her years of courtroom experience evident in her bearing. "Now," Officer Barrett said, circling her like a predator, "why don't you tell me whose car this really is? And what's this parking permit for?" He pointed to the university faculty sticker on her windshield. "Did you clean their offices or something?" Little did Officer Barrett know that his words were being recorded not just by the bystanders, but also by Dr. Washington's own car's dashboard camera, a security measure she had installed years ago at her brother's insistence, the same brother who now served as the state's lieutenant governor. The rain continued to fall, and Dr. Washington stood silently, watching Officer Barrett dig himself deeper and deeper into a hole that would soon swallow his entire career. The rain fell harder now, soaking through Dr. Washington's expensive suit as Officer Barrett continued his harassment. More cars had slowed down to watch the scene, and several people stood under umbrellas across the street, their phones raised to record everything. "I asked you a question," Barrett said, his voice getting louder. "Where did you get this car? These registration papers look real enough, but something doesn't add up here." Dr. Washington took a deep breath, remembering the countless times she had advised her clients to stay calm in similar situations. "Officer Barrett, as I've shown you, the car is registered in my name, Dr. Eleanor Washington. The university parking permit is also mine, as I am a full professor at the law school." Barrett let out a dismissive laugh. A professor? At City University Law School. He walked around the Mercedes again, running his hand along its wet surface. That's a good one. Look, lady, why don't you stop wasting my time and tell me the truth? Across the street, Sarah Chen, a junior reporter for the local news website, recognized Dr. Washington immediately. Just last week, she had covered the prestigious ceremony where Dr. Washington was appointed head of the Police Oversight Committee. Sarah's hands trembled as she recorded the unfolding scene, knowing she was witnessing something significant. "Officer," Dr. Washington said calmly, rain dripping from her silver hair, "I provided all my documentation. My license shows that I am indeed Dr. Eleanor Washington. The car registration matches. The insurance is current. Is there something specific that you find suspicious?" Barrett's face reddened. He didn't like her calm, educated tone. "What I find suspicious," he said, getting closer to her face, "is an old colored woman driving a $100,000 car in this neighborhood. Now, maybe you borrowed it from your employer, or maybe there's something else going on here." A small crowd had gathered despite the rain. Mrs. Peterson, who lived in the house across the street, had come out onto her porch. She knew Dr. Washington well. The professor had given her grandson free tutoring for his law school entrance exams last summer. "This is ridiculous," Mrs. Peterson called out. "That's Dr. Washington. She lives just 3 blocks from here." Officer Barrett turned sharply. "Ma'am, stay out of this unless you want to be arrested for interfering with police business." Dr. Washington noticed Barrett's body camera was turned off, a direct violation of department policy. She also noticed his hands shaking slightly, suggesting he was operating on emotion rather than professional training. She had seen this behavior countless times in her career, but experiencing it firsthand was different. "Now," Barrett continued, turning back to Dr. Washington, "pop the trunk. I need to check what you're carrying." "Officer Barrett," Dr. Washington said firmly, "you pulled me over claiming I ran a stop sign, which I did not do. You have seen my valid documentation. Unless you have probable cause to search my vehicle, I do not consent to any searches." Barrett's face twisted with anger. "Oh, so now you're a lawyer too." He reached for his handcuffs. "Maybe we should continue this conversation down at the station." Sarah Chen had edged closer, her reporter's instincts telling her this was about to become an even bigger story. She watched as Dr. Washington stood perfectly still, her dignity intact despite being soaked to the skin. "Before you proceed, Officer Barrett," Dr. Washington said quietly, "I want you to think very carefully about your next action. Every moment of this interaction is being recorded, not just by these witnesses, but by my dashboard camera as well. Would you like to explain to your superiors why you're attempting to arrest the head of the Police Oversight Committee without cause?" Barrett's hand froze halfway to his handcuffs. Something in her tone made him hesitate, but his pride wouldn't let him back down. "You expect me to believe that?" He scoffed, but there was a note of uncertainty in his voice now. The rain continued to pour, but no one moved. They had all sensed they were witnessing a turning point, a moment when power dynamics were about to shift dramatically. Dr. Washington stood calmly in the rain, watching Officer Barrett's growing realization that he might have just made the biggest mistake of his career. While Officer Barrett stood frozen in the rain, his hand still hovering near his handcuffs, his radio crackled to life. "Unit 247, please respond to dispatch immediately." The voice sounded urgent. Barrett hesitated, then reached for his radio, keeping his eyes on Dr. Washington. "Unit 247 responding," he said, trying to maintain his authoritative tone. "Officer Barrett, is your body camera operational?" the dispatcher asked. Barrett's face paled slightly as he realized someone at the station must have been alerted to the situation. "Negative," he replied, his voice less confident now. "There were technical difficulties." "Turn it on immediately," the dispatcher ordered. "And please confirm, is the driver of the vehicle Dr. Eleanor Washington?" The small crowd of onlookers watched as Barrett's expression changed from confusion to shock. Sarah Chen, the reporter, stepped closer, making sure to capture every word of this exchange on her phone. "Yes, the driver claims to be Dr. Washington," Barrett said into his radio. "Officer Barrett, be advised that Dr. Eleanor Washington is not only the newly appointed head of the Police Oversight Committee, but also the sister of Lieutenant Governor Marcus Thompson. She has level 1 civilian clearance at police headquarters. The color drained completely from Barrett's face. In his 8 years on the force, he had never bothered to learn about the civilian oversight board members. If he had, he would have recognized Dr. Washington's name immediately. Just then, a sleek black SUV pulled up to the scene. Lieutenant Sarah Martinez, head of internal affairs, stepped out with an umbrella. She had been having coffee at a nearby diner when she received multiple calls about the situation. "Dr. Washington," Lieutenant Martinez called out, hurrying over with the umbrella. "I apologize for this unfortunate incident. Are you all right?" Dr. Washington gave a small, dignified nod. "I'm wet, Lieutenant Martinez, but otherwise unharmed." She had worked closely with Martinez on several police reform initiatives over the past decade. Officer Barrett stood rigid, suddenly realizing the full magnitude of his mistake. This wasn't just any elderly black woman he had decided to harass. This was Dr. Eleanor Washington, whose career fighting against police misconduct was legendary in legal circles. Sarah Chen quickly Googled Dr. Washington on her phone and gasped at what she found. The professor had won landmark cases against police departments across the country. She had helped establish new guidelines for traffic stops that were now used in police academies nationwide. Her appointment to head the Police Oversight Committee had been front-page news just last week. "Officer Barrett," Lieutenant Martinez said sharply, "return to your vehicle and wait for me there." Her tone left no room for argument. As Barrett retreated to his cruiser, Martinez turned to Dr. Washington. "Would you like to file a formal complaint now, Doctor? I can take your statement personally." But Dr. Washington had something else in mind. 40 years of fighting for civil rights had taught her that individual punishments rarely led to systemic change. She looked at Barrett sitting in his cruiser, then at the growing crowd of witnesses, and finally at Sarah Chen with her camera. "Lieutenant," she said thoughtfully, "I believe this incident presents us with an opportunity. Instead of just filing a complaint, I'd like to use this as a teaching moment for the entire department." Martinez nodded, understanding immediately. Dr. Washington's reputation for turning negative incidents into positive changes was well known in law enforcement circles. From his cruiser, Barrett watched the two women talking, his career flashing before his eyes. He had no way of knowing that Dr. Washington's next actions would not only impact his future, but would reshape the entire department's approach to community policing. Mrs. Peterson, still watching from her porch, smiled knowingly. She had seen Dr. Washington turn around seemingly hopeless situations before. The professor had a unique way of addressing injustice, not with anger or revenge, but with wisdom and a determination to create lasting change. The rain began to ease up, and a ray of sunlight broke through the clouds, as if nature itself was acknowledging that something remarkable was about to unfold. Sarah Chen's fingers flew across her phone's keyboard as she posted updates to her news website. Within minutes, the story of Officer Barrett's confrontation with Dr. Washington began spreading across social media like wildfire. The young reporter knew this could be the biggest story of her career. "Dr. Washington," Sarah called out respectfully, "would you be willing to give a statement about what just happened here?" Before Dr. Washington could respond, more news vans began arriving at the scene. The local media had picked up on Sarah's initial posts, especially after people recognized Dr. Washington in the videos that witnesses had already shared online. Mrs. Peterson, still watching from her porch, invited Dr. Washington to come dry off. "You'll catch your death in those wet clothes," she said, concerned for her neighbor. Lieutenant Martinez walked with Dr. Washington to the porch, while keeping a watchful eye on Officer Barrett in his cruiser. Inside Mrs. Peterson's cozy living room, the elderly neighbor brought out fresh towels and a warm cup of tea. "I can't believe how calm you stayed through all that," Mrs. Peterson said, shaking her head. "If he had talked to me that way." "Sometimes," Dr. Washington replied, drying her hair with a towel. "The calmest response is the most powerful one." She looked out the window at the growing media presence on the street. "And sometimes, the real victory isn't in punishing one person, but in changing the system that allowed their behavior in the first place." Outside, more witnesses from the incident were talking to reporters. James Wilson, a college student who had recorded everything on his phone, was showing his footage to a local news crew. The way that officer spoke to her, it was like he enjoyed humiliating her, he said. He didn't know she was someone important, but that shouldn't matter. Nobody should be treated that way. Tracy Martinez, a high school teacher who had been jogging by when the incident began, shared her own video. "I started recording because something felt wrong," she explained to a reporter. The officer's tone was aggressive from the start. Dr. Washington showed her ID right away, but he kept questioning her like she was lying. Meanwhile, Sarah Chen had discovered more about Dr. Washington's background. According to public records, she reported live on her news channel's social media stream. Dr. Washington has won over 200 civil rights cases in her career. She helped write our state's current guidelines on police conduct during traffic stops, the very guidelines that Officer Barrett appears to have violated repeatedly during this incident. Lieutenant Martinez was on her phone, dealing with a flood of calls from police headquarters. The chief of police wanted to hold an emergency press conference. The mayor's office was asking for details. Even the governor's office had called, concerned about the treatment of the lieutenant governor's sister. Through Mrs. Peterson's window, Dr. Washington watched as Officer Barrett sat in his cruiser, his head in his hands. She noticed how young he looked, probably no older than her youngest grandson. In her 4 decades of civil rights work, she had seen many officers like him, not necessarily evil people, but products of a system that needed serious reform. "What are you thinking?" Mrs. Peterson asked, noticing Dr. Washington's thoughtful expression. "I'm thinking about all the people this has happened to who weren't professors or committee heads," Dr. Washington replied. "People who didn't have witnesses or cameras recording. People who didn't have a lieutenant governor for a brother." She sipped her tea and stood up, her wet clothes now somewhat drier. "That's why what happens next is so important." Lieutenant Martinez entered the house after knocking politely. "Dr. Washington, the chief of police would like to meet with you immediately." He suggested holding an emergency meeting of the Oversight Committee. Dr. Washington nodded, her mind already forming a plan. The videos of this incident would make it impossible for the department to ignore the problem any longer. But instead of seeking revenge against one officer, she saw an opportunity to push for the comprehensive reforms she had been advocating for years. As she prepared to leave Mrs. Peterson's house, she looked one more time at Officer Barrett in his cruiser. Tomorrow, you would learn that his worst career mistake might actually lead to his most important lesson, and to changes that would affect police officers and citizens across the entire state. The police headquarters was buzzing with activity as Dr. Washington walked through the front doors, her clothes still damp from the rain. Despite her disheveled appearance, she carried herself with the same dignity she had shown during the traffic stop. Lieutenant Martinez walked beside her, while 2 other officers rushed to bring her a chair and a fresh cup of coffee. "Dr. Washington," Chief Robert Thompson said, hurrying out of his office to meet her, "I want to personally apologize for Officer Barrett's conduct. We're preparing his suspension papers right now." Dr. Washington raised her hand to stop him. "Before we discuss any punishments, Chief, I'd like to review Officer Barrett's complete service record." Her voice was firm but gentle. "And I want to see all civilian complaints filed against him." The chief looked uncomfortable. "That might take some time to gather." "Actually," Dr. Washington said, reaching into her wet briefcase and pulling out a folder protected in a plastic sleeve, "I already have them here. As head of the Oversight Committee, I reviewed all officer records last week. Officer Barrett has had 7 complaints of racial bias in the past 3 years, but not a single one was properly investigated." The room fell silent. Sarah Chen, who had been allowed inside as press, furiously took notes. The young reporter couldn't believe her luck. She was witnessing history in the making. "What's more interesting," Dr. Washington continued, opening the folder, "is that Officer Barrett's early performance reviews were excellent. He graduated top of his class at the academy. Something changed in the last 3 years, and I want to know why." Lieutenant Martinez stepped forward. "Ma'am, I've been reviewing the dashboard camera footage from your car. Combined with the witness videos, we have clear evidence of at least 12 policy violations during your stop alone." Dr. Washington nodded, but her mind was working on a bigger picture. She turned to Sarah Chen. "Ms. Chen, would you note that the Police Oversight Committee will be holding an emergency public session tomorrow at 9 a.m. We'll be discussing not just today's incident, but the broader issues it represents." The chief shifted nervously. "Dr. Washington, perhaps we should handle this internally first." "Chief Thompson," she replied calmly, For 40 years, I've watched departments try to handle these incidents internally. That approach has failed. Change only happens when we bring these issues into the light. Just then, Dr. Washington's brother, Lieutenant Governor Marcus Thompson, burst into the room. "Ellie, are you okay? I came as soon as I heard." He was still wearing his suit from a state senate session. "I'm fine, Marcus," she assured him. "In fact, I think this incident might help us push through those police reform bills you've been trying to pass." The lieutenant governor looked at his sister with admiration. Even after being humiliated in the rain, she was thinking about how to create positive change. This was why she had been so successful in her career. She never let anger cloud her judgment. Dr. Washington stood up, straightening her damp jacket. "Chief Thompson, I want all records of similar complaints from the past 5 years on my desk by tomorrow morning. Lieutenant Martinez, please ensure Officer Barrett attends tomorrow's committee meeting." She paused, then added, "And make sure he comes in his full-dress uniform." As people rushed to follow her directions, Dr. Washington turned to Sarah Chen. "Miss Chen, would you like an exclusive interview about the reforms we'll be proposing tomorrow?" Sarah's eyes widened with excitement. "Yes, absolutely." "Good," Dr. Washington said. "Because what happened today isn't just about one officer or one traffic stop. It's about patterns of behavior that need to change, and tomorrow we start making those changes." As she walked out of the police headquarters, Dr. Washington thought about Officer Barrett, still sitting in his cruiser back on Oak Street. Tomorrow, he would face consequences for his actions, but not in the way he expected. Sometimes, the best way to fight discrimination wasn't through punishment alone, but through education and systemic change. The sun had finally come out, and her clothes were beginning to dry. Dr. Washington smiled, knowing that tomorrow would bring not just justice, but an opportunity for real transformation. The next morning, the Police Oversight Committee's meeting room was packed. Every seat was taken, and people lined the walls. News cameras were set up in the back, and Sarah Chen sat in the front row, her laptop ready. The incident videos had gone viral overnight, with millions of views across social media. Officer Barrett sat stiffly in his dress uniform, alone in the front row. His usual confidence was gone, replaced by nervous glances at the door. He had spent a sleepless night watching the videos of himself, seeing his actions through different eyes for the first time. At exactly 9 a.m., Dr. Washington walked in, wearing a fresh navy blue suit. The room fell silent as she took her place at the center of the committee table. She arranged her papers carefully, then looked directly at Officer Barrett. "Before we begin," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the room, "I want to share some findings from our investigation." She opened a thick folder. "Officer James Barrett, your record shows a disturbing pattern." Lieutenant Martinez stepped forward with a laptop and projector. The screen behind Dr. Washington came to life, showing a chart of complaints against Barrett over the past 3 years. In January 2022, Mrs. Gloria Jenkins, age 65, filed a complaint stating you accused her of stealing her own car. Dr. Washington read from the file. In March 2022, Dr. Michael Chen reported that you refused to believe he was a resident of his own neighborhood. In June 2022, Reverend James Wilson said you detained him for suspicious behavior while he was watering flowers in his own front yard. Barrett's face grew redder with each example. He hadn't realized all these incidents had been documented. "But here's what's most interesting," Dr. Washington continued, changing the display to show Barrett's earlier records. "Your first 2 years on the force were exemplary. You received commendations for community policing. You volunteered at youth centers. You were even nominated for Officer of the Year in 2020. Confused murmurs spread through the room. This didn't sound like the same officer from the viral videos. "Officer Barrett," Dr. Washington said, her voice softening slightly, "would you like to explain what changed 3 years ago?" The room went quiet. Barrett looked up, surprised by the question. He hadn't expected to be asked about his side of the story. He started, his voice shaky. 3 years ago, my partner was shot during a traffic stop. After that, I guess I started seeing danger everywhere. Started assuming the worst in everyone." Dr. Washington nodded. "Did you receive any counseling after that incident?" "No, ma'am," Barrett replied. "I didn't want to appear weak. In the force, we're taught to be tough, to handle things on our own." Sarah Chen typed furiously, capturing every word. This was turning into a very different story than anyone had expected. Dr. Washington turned to Chief Thompson. Chief, can you explain why an officer who experienced trauma was allowed to continue patrolling without any psychological support? The chief shifted uncomfortably. Our department has counseling services available, but we can't force officers to use them. And that, Dr. Washington said firmly, is exactly the problem we're here to address. She pulled out another document. I have here a proposal for mandatory trauma support services for all officers who experience violent incidents. Additionally, we're implementing quarterly bias recognition training and monthly community engagement requirements. She looked around the room. What happened yesterday wasn't just about one traffic stop or one officer. It was about a system that fails both its officers and its citizens. When we don't help our officers process their trauma, we shouldn't be surprised when they start viewing the world through a lens of fear and bias. Barrett sat straighter in his chair, listening intently now. For the first time, he felt like someone understood what had happened to him, even while holding him accountable for his actions. This investigation, Dr. Washington concluded, has revealed not just individual misconduct, but systemic failures that require systemic solutions. And that's exactly what we're going to implement, starting today. The room buzzed with anticipation. This wasn't going to be a simple disciplinary hearing. It was the beginning of real change. The tension in the hearing room grew as Dr. Washington stood up from her chair. She walked slowly around the committee table, each step echoing in the silent room. Officer Barrett watched her approach, his hands gripping his knees tightly. Officer Barrett, she said, stopping directly in front of him, I'd like you to watch something. She nodded to Lieutenant Martinez, who started playing a new video on the large screen. The video showed a younger Barrett, from 3 years ago, helping an elderly woman change a flat tire in the rain. Another clip showed him playing basketball with neighborhood kids. Then came footage of him receiving an award for de-escalating a dangerous situation without violence. This was you, Dr. Washington said quietly, an officer who earned the community's trust. Someone who saw the people he served as human beings, not threats. Barrett's eyes were fixed on the screen, watching his former self. A few tears rolled down his cheeks, but he quickly wiped them away. Then the video changed to the dashboard camera footage from yesterday. The contrast was stark, his harsh voice, his aggressive posture, the way he had treated Dr. Washington with such disrespect. When your partner was shot, Dr. Washington continued, something broke inside you. Instead of getting help, you buried your pain beneath anger and suspicion. Every traffic stop became a potential threat. Every citizen became a possible enemy. Sarah Chen watched in amazement as Dr. Washington transformed the hearing from a punishment into something more like an intervention. The young reporter realized she was witnessing a masterclass in restorative justice. I have here, Dr. Washington said, holding up another folder, statements from 12 other citizens who experienced similar treatment from you. But I also have letters from citizens you helped before your partner's shooting. The difference is striking. She turned to address the whole room. This is what trauma does when we don't address it. This is what happens when we tell our officers to be tough instead of human. This is how good police officers become part of the problem instead of part of the solution. Barrett's shoulders began to shake as he struggled to maintain his composure. I never meant to become this person, he said, his voice breaking. After Mike got shot, I just couldn't shake the fear. Every time I pulled someone over, I saw his face, saw the blood. Dr. Washington placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. Officer Barrett, what happened to your partner was tragic. But what you've done since then has created more trauma, not just for yourself, but for every person you've treated unfairly. The room was completely silent now, everyone hanging on every word. Yesterday, Dr. Washington continued. You pulled over a 68-year-old woman and left her standing in the rain. You mocked her achievements, questioned her integrity, and tried to humiliate her. Not because of anything she did, but because you'd been looking at the world through the lens of your own unhealed wounds. Barrett couldn't hold back his tears anymore. I'm sorry, he whispered. I'm so sorry. I know you are, Dr. Washington replied. But sorry isn't enough. We need change, real change. Are you willing to do the work? Barrett looked up at her, then at the screen still showing his younger self. Yes, he said firmly. Whatever it takes. Dr. Washington turned to the committee. Then I move that instead of termination, Officer Barrett be required to undergo trauma counseling, complete our new bias training program, and work with community leaders to rebuild the trust he's broken. She looked back at Barrett. This won't be easy. You'll need to face your trauma, confront your biases, and learn to see the community as allies again, not enemies. Are you prepared for that? Barrett stood up straight, squaring his shoulders. Yes, ma'am. I want to be that officer again, he said, pointing to the screen showing his younger self. I want to make things right. Dr. Washington nodded, a small smile crossing her face. Then let's begin. 6 months had passed since that rainy afternoon traffic stop. The police department's community room was filled with officers, community leaders, and citizens gathered for a special ceremony. Sarah Chen sat in her usual spot, ready to document another chapter in this remarkable story. Officer James Barrett stood at the podium, looking very different from the angry man who had harassed Dr. Washington half a year ago. His face was softer now, his eyes clearer, and his stance more relaxed. Behind him sat Dr. Washington, watching with quiet satisfaction. 6 months ago, Barrett began, his voice steady, I was a man drowning in my own fear and prejudice. I had forgotten why I became a police officer in the first place. He paused, looking at the audience. But someone wise enough to see past my anger gave me a chance to remember. The screen behind him showed pictures from the past 6 months. Barrett in counseling sessions, attending community meetings, working with youth groups, and participating in bias training workshops. Each image told part of his journey toward healing and change. Dr. Washington could have ended my career that day, he continued. Instead, she helped save it, and probably saved me too. Through her guidance, I learned that true strength isn't about power or control. It's about understanding, empathy, and the courage to face our own demons. Dr. Washington nodded slightly, remembering their many conversations during his rehabilitation process. She had watched him struggle, grow, and slowly become the officer he used to be, perhaps even better. Today, Barrett announced, I'm proud to say that our department's new trauma support program has helped 15 other officers deal with similar experiences. He gestured to a group of officers in the audience. We're learning that asking for help isn't weakness, it's wisdom. Chief Thompson stepped forward to present some remarkable statistics. Civilian complaints had dropped by 40% since implementing Dr. Washington's reforms. Officer participation in community events had tripled. The department had become a model for other cities looking to improve police-community relations. Mrs. Peterson, who had sheltered Dr. Washington during the initial incident, stood up to share her perspective. 6 months ago, I watched my neighbor being mistreated by an officer. Today, that same officer helps my grandson with his homework at the community center. That's what real change looks like. Dr. Washington finally rose to speak. The room fell silent as she approached the podium, her presence as commanding as ever. What happened that rainy afternoon could have ended in many ways, she began. It could have been just another story of punishment and bitterness. Instead, it became a story of transformation. She smiled at Barrett. Officer Barrett's journey reminds us that justice isn't always about punishment. Sometimes, it's about creating opportunities for change. She revealed that the state legislature had just passed the Community Trust and Police Support Act, which would implement similar reforms across the state. Her brother, the lieutenant governor, had used their story to convince even the most skeptical lawmakers. But the real success, she continued, isn't in the laws or programs we've created. It's in the lives that have been changed. She gestured to Barrett. It's in officers like James, who found the courage to face their trauma and become better servants of their community. Barrett stood straighter, pride replacing the shame he had carried for so long. His eyes met Dr. Washington's, filled with gratitude. And so, Dr. Washington concluded, what began as a moment of discrimination has become a movement of transformation. This is how change happens, not through revenge or punishment alone, but through understanding, courage, and the willingness to see the humanity in each other. As the room erupted in applause, Sarah Chen wrote her final notes. She had covered this story from the beginning, watching it transform from a viral video of police misconduct into something far more powerful, a testament to the possibility of real change. Outside, the sun was shining brightly, and through the window, they could see new recruits practicing community engagement techniques in the parking lot. The world wasn't perfect, but in this small corner of it, things were getting better, one changed heart at a time.